The house on Hollow Birch Lane was the kind of place people fantasized about. Quaint, nestled beneath a canopy of ancient trees, its wraparound porch kissed by golden afternoon light. Emily stood at the threshold, gripping the key in her palm, while Jake wrestled with the last of their moving boxes. "It's perfect," she murmured, stepping inside. It even smelled like a fresh start. Aged wood and faint traces of lavender, as if the previous owner had left behind a whisper of warmth. The space was bigger than their last cramped apartment, the creaky floors and slanted door frames adding a rustic charm. And the price? Almost too good to be true for a house in this neighborhood. Almost. Emily had skimmed the real estate listing multiple times, noting the lack of details about its former occupant, Daniel Foster. That was the name on the paperwork, but there was no mention of a sale, no forwarding address, just an abrupt previous owner vacated and a house left eerily intact, furniture gone, but the marks of life still lingering. She pushed the thought aside as she and Jake settled in, filling the space with laughter, music, and the comforting normalcy of unpacking. They made toasts to new beginnings, to finally having a damn house, as Jake put it. By the time night fell, Emily felt the familiar exhaustion of a long-moving day. But sleep didn't come easy. The first time she heard it, she was curled under the blankets, on the verge of slipping into a dream. A faint, irregular scratching. Her eyes flicked open. The sound came from above, deep in the attic, just above their bed, like nails skimming over wood, slow, deliberate. She held her breath, listening, nothing. Emily exhaled, shaking her head. It was an old house. Old houses made noises. She turned onto her side, curling into Jake's warmth. But just as her eyelids grew heavy again, scratch, scratch, scratch. A chill ghosted down her spine. Her gaze lifted toward the ceiling. Something was up there, and it was moving. The noises didn't stop. If anything, they grew worse. At first, it was just the scratching, soft and infrequent, like something testing the boundaries of its cage. Then a few nights later, Emily awoke to something new. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. A careful shuffle against the wooden beams above their bedroom. Not the frantic scurry of a rat or raccoon. Something heavier, something with purpose. Lying still beneath the blankets, she strained to hear. Past the wild beating of her own heart. Step, step, step. Her breath hitched. She turned toward Jake, fast asleep, his face slack with exhaustion. He hadn't stirred. How could he not hear this? Emily clenched her fists beneath the sheets, forcing herself to breathe, to think logically. It's an old house, settling, a trick of acoustics, a raccoon, a possum. But none of those explanations accounted for what she found the next morning. Jake was already in the kitchen when she stumbled in, her skin still crawling from another restless night. "Morning, Em. You okay?" He took one look at her face and frowned. "You look like you saw a ghost." She wanted to laugh at that, if only he knew. "Have you been hearing anything weird?" she asked hesitantly. Jake's brow furrowed. "Weird like what?" "Like something in the attic." At that, his face relaxed into amusement. "Oh, that. Yeah, I figured it's just an animal. I'll check it out later, put some traps up." Emily wanted to believe him. She really did. But as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her gaze drifted toward the hallway, and she saw it. The attic hatch. It hung open by an inch. Her stomach twisted. "Jake," she whispered, "did you go up there already?" He followed her gaze, his expression shifting from relaxed to confused. "No." "Why?" Emily's fingers tightened around her mug. Then who opened it? She had no answer. But that night, When the footsteps returned, she swore they sounded closer. Emily had to know. The fear gnawing at her insides, the quiet desperation clawing at her throat. She couldn't live with it anymore. Jake had brushed it off, dismissed it as just an animal, but the unease in her gut told her otherwise. Something was wrong in this house, and she needed proof. That evening she sat in the living room, setting up the camera with trembling hands. It was a simple motion detection camera she had used before for mundane reasons, catching her cat's late-night adventures. But tonight, it was for something darker, something that had been lurking just above her head for days. She trained the camera on the attic hatch. The tiny lens blinked in the dim light, silently awaiting its charge. "Tonight, I'll have answers," Emily muttered, more to herself than to Jake, who had been distant and absorbed in unpacking the last of their boxes. As midnight approached, she heard it, the familiar scratching in the walls. Her body stiffened as she watched the time crawl past. But tonight, there was no denying the slow, rhythmic progression of those footsteps. The air in the room grew thick, the walls seeming to pulse with the weight of each step. Her heart raced, but she didn't move. She waited. The camera recorded in silence, its small red light blinking softly. The minutes stretched on, but the movement above her didn't stop. Instead, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. They seemed to come closer with every second. Emily's pulse quickened, her eyes glued to the screen. Was something about to descend from the attic? Then just when the tension reached its peak, it happened. The shadow. It flickered across the frame. A dark, indistinct shape. No features, just the vague outline of something too tall, too broad to be human. Yet its movements were unmistakable. It crept down the attic ladder, but only partially, never fully in the camera's view, always just out of focus, its outline melting into the surrounding darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Was it moving down toward them? She leaned closer to the screen, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't dare blink. The shadow inched lower, its presence undeniable. Something was coming closer, step by agonizing step. Suddenly the video cut out. The red light on the camera blinked erratically, flickering in the dying light of the room. Emily gasped, rushing to check the feed, her fingers shaking uncontrollably as she scrolled through the footage. But it wasn't the video that caught her attention. It was something else. Scratches. Faint but unmistakable, a trail of deep gouges in the floorboards leading directly from the camera's vantage point toward their bedroom door. Her heart slammed against her rib cage as she swallowed down a scream. Her mind raced. What was she dealing with? What was coming for them? No more rationalizations, no more excuses. There was something in the attic, and it wasn't stopping. Emily couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Foster. The name haunted her, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts, like an old scar that itched no matter how much she tried to ignore it. The more she thought about the house, the more she realized she knew nothing about the man who had lived here before them. Sure, the real estate agent had mentioned his disappearance, but no one had offered any more details. It was as if the house had been scrubbed clean of its past, leaving behind only whispers of something unsettling. She had to know more. One quiet afternoon, while Jake was in the garage fixing an old lamp, Emily found herself digging through old newspapers at the local library. The smell of aged paper filled the air, the musty scent of forgotten stories and long-buried truths. She sifted through stacks of yellowing articles, her eyes scanning for anything related to Daniel Foster. It didn't take long to find it. An article from 6 years ago caught her attention. The headline read, Local man vanishes without a trace. Foul play suspected. Emily's pulse quickened as she read the details. Daniel Foster, a quiet man in his early 40s, had been reported missing after neighbors noticed strange behavior. He had stopped coming to work and rarely left the house. When the police conducted a welfare check, they found his home in perfect condition, except for one thing: the attic. Neighbors recalled how Foster had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He'd spoken about someone living in his attic, someone he couldn't see, but could feel. The stories he told were disjointed, fearful ramblings, filled with nonsensical phrases. "It's coming for me." That's all he'd said to a close friend the night before he vanished. Emily's skin prickled. She read the words again. "It's coming for me." Was this what she was hearing at night? Was the thing in the attic the same entity that had driven Daniel Foster to madness? She dug deeper, flipping through more articles, but all they revealed was the same unsettling pattern. Foster had become more isolated, retreating into his home, and eventually, the police had closed the case. No body was ever found, no clues. The house remained empty, waiting for the next tenant to move in. Emily slammed the papers down in frustration. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who or what had Foster been so afraid of? And why did it feel like whatever was in the attic knew her? She couldn't shake the sensation that the entity, whatever it was, had been waiting for her. It was familiar, as if it had been drawn to her somehow. But how? What was the connection? And then it hit her, the mirror in the attic. She remembered faintly, from when they first moved in, how the previous owners had left behind a few items: furniture, old trinkets, and even a full-length mirror. It had been tucked away in the far corner of the attic, covered by an old sheet, its glass dull and untouched. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now the image of the mirror filled her mind. Had it always been there? Emily felt a creeping unease crawl through her. She couldn't help but wonder, was it the mirror that held the key to everything? She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see the attic again. With a sense of grim determination, Emily grabbed her flashlight and made her way toward the stairs. The moment she stepped onto the first step, she felt it. The air in the house seemed to shift, thickening, as if it was closing in on her. Something was waiting. The attic was colder than it had ever been, the air so thick with tension that it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emily's flashlight quivered in her hand as she slowly ascended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. She had come back to confront whatever was lurking above, but a gnawing feeling at the back of her mind told her that this time things would be different. This time, she wasn't just investigating a series of strange occurrences. She was hunting a malevolent presence that seemed to be watching her every move. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached the top of the stairs, staring at the attic hatch in front of her. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been on the first night she'd noticed the sounds from above. The faint smell of dust and decay clung to the air, mingling with something else, something sour and wrong. She reached for the handle and hesitated. Her breath caught when she heard it, a whisper. It was so faint that at first Emily thought she imagined it, but then it came again, a soft murmur just beyond the threshold. "Emily." She froze. The voice was low, almost melodic, yet it sent a jolt of terror through her. It knew her name. How could it know? It was impossible. No one could have known she'd be standing here, not after everything she'd researched. But the whisper came again, this time more urgent. "Emily." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as her heartbeat picked up pace. She had to get in there. She had to understand what was happening. Without thinking, she pushed the attic door fully open, the hinges creaking in protest. The beam of her flashlight swept across the space inside, illuminating the bare rafters and the piles of old forgotten furniture. But something was off. Everything felt too still, too quiet. And then she saw it, the mirror. It stood in the far corner, its surface reflecting the dim light from her flashlight. Emily had forgotten about it, but now that she saw it, a chill spread through her bones. The glass was unnaturally smooth, like it had been polished recently, and yet it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Something about it felt wrong, like a deep yawning void waiting to swallow her. But the thing that truly terrified her wasn't the mirror itself. It was the whisper that came next. "Don't look in the mirror, Emily." Her heart skipped a beat, and she spun toward the sound of the voice. There, standing just outside the beam of her flashlight's light, was something shifting, a presence, but not quite human. It was a dark shape, a shadow, constantly moving, constantly changing. And it wasn't alone. Small childlike laughter echoed in the room, the sound of it cold and hollow. It sounded like her mother, but wrong. The song her mother used to hum when she tucked her into bed, the tune that was a comforting lullaby when Emily was young, filled the attic like a haunting echo. It was warped, distorted, and the laughter only grew louder. And then the whispers came again. "They don't know, Emily. They don't know what you did." The voice grew louder, more insistent. She felt the cold grip of panic rise in her chest as the temperature in the attic plummeted. The walls closed in around her, the very air pushing against her, like something was trying to choke the breath from her lungs. But she couldn't tear herself away from the mirror. The whispers were so persistent, so personal. Her mother's lullaby mixed with the ominous warning from the voice. "They know everything, Emily. You can't escape." She felt her feet move against her will, inching her closer to the mirror. The reflection seemed to distort, shimmering, as though something was pressing against the glass from the other side. It wasn't a simple reflection anymore. No, it was alive, moving, shifting. Emily's own face was staring back at her, but something was wrong. Her eyes were different. In the reflection, her face was hollow. Her eyes were dark, empty voids. Emily recoiled, stumbling backward, but the whispering didn't stop. It was as though the air itself was alive, filled with voices that crawled under her skin. And then the entity spoke again. This time, in a voice that wasn't quite human, but not entirely foreign either. It was familiar. "You've been here before, Emily." Her stomach turned. The house, the attic, the mirror. It all felt so familiar, as if it were something she'd been connected to in some way, long before moving into this house. The feeling was suffocating. How could it know so much about her? Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the scratching noise returned, louder now, closer. There was something else in the attic with her, something real, solid, and it was drawing closer with each breath she took. The thing in the attic was alive, and it knew her past. Emily stumbled toward the attic door, heart racing, mind in chaos. The whispers followed her, suffocating her, until she bolted down the stairs without looking back. The air behind her seemed to push at her, clawing at her heels. When she reached the bottom, she slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the whispers didn't stop. They had followed her down, and it wasn't just the entity in the attic anymore. It was everywhere. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house had always been full of tension, the shadows creeping deeper each night. But lately, Jake, her husband, her anchor, had become distant. She noticed the changes slowly at first, the way his eyes seemed to lack focus, as if he were always somewhere else, the way he would suddenly fall silent during conversations, his gaze unfocused, before he'd snap back to the present as though nothing had happened. But it wasn't just that. It was the feeling, the sense that he wasn't quite himself anymore. At first, Emily tried to chalk it up to stress. The moving, the unsettling happenings in the house, the pressure to make their new life together perfect. Maybe it was getting to him. But as days passed, the changes became harder to ignore. The first instance that truly set her on edge occurred one night when she woke up to the sound of Jake whispering. She blinked in the darkness, groggy, unsure if she had imagined it. But then she heard it again. "Emily." The voice was soft, but there was something about it, something off. It wasn't Jake's usual tone. It was too low, too breathy. Emily turned over to face him. He was lying next to her, eyes closed, but his lips were moving. The whispering continued. "Emily, it's too late." She sat up, heart racing. She tried to shake him awake, but Jake didn't stir. It was like he wasn't even aware she was there. His body was still, but his lips kept moving, uttering words that didn't make sense. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until Emily felt like her skin was crawling. "They're watching." She gasped and pulled away. It wasn't just the whispering. There was something else in his expression. His face was frozen in that half-asleep state. But his eyes, they were wide open, but they were vacant, empty. His pupils were unnaturally large, too dark, and his skin had a strange pallor, like the life was draining from him. The moment passed as suddenly as it came. Jake's breathing became steady again, and his eyes closed. He seemed to settle back into a peaceful sleep. But Emily didn't. She sat there in the dark, staring at him, the weight of her terror sinking in. Something was wrong. She couldn't deny it anymore. The next day, Jake's behavior grew even stranger. He was quieter than usual, barely speaking at all. When he did, it was in short, disjointed sentences. He seemed to forget entire conversations, or worse, he acted like they hadn't even happened. "Remember last night? We talked about moving the couch into the living room," Emily said over breakfast, trying to piece together the jumbled mess of his behavior. Jake just blinked at her, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about? We didn't talk about anything last night." Emily's stomach twisted in disbelief. "Jake, we did. He interrupted her with a distracted wave. "You must be imagining things. You've been stressed. We should get out of the house today, take a walk." It wasn't like him to dismiss her so abruptly. She frowned, staring at him. This wasn't Jake. The strangest moment came later that evening. Jake was standing in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, his hands gripping the back of the couch. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there utterly still. Emily called his name, but he didn't react. "Jake?" she asked again, her voice growing more anxious. Finally, he turned toward her, but his movements were slow, stiff, as if his body were no longer entirely his own. His lips parted, and what came out was not Jake's voice. "You shouldn't have come back, Emily." It wasn't just the tone. It was the words. The voice was too low, too alien, like a dark shadow, not of this world. She felt her blood run cold as she took a step back. "Jake, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But Jake didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step toward her, his eyes fixed on hers, unblinking, unseeing. He was like a puppet, and something was pulling his strings. Emily felt her pulse race. "I'm waiting for you." His eyes flicked to the attic door, and Emily's breath hitched. She didn't know if he was aware of what he was saying or if it was the entity, whatever had taken hold of him, speaking through him. She wanted to run, to escape, but she was frozen in place. With sudden clarity, she realized the entity wasn't just in the attic anymore. It had found Jake. It had taken him. That night, Emily lay in bed, her back pressed tightly against the wall as far from Jake as possible. She didn't dare close her eyes. The house was eerily silent, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on her chest. She couldn't help but feel that she was being watched. Her heartbeat quickened as the silence stretched, unbearable. Then she heard the softest sound, the creaking of the floorboards. Slowly she turned toward Jake, who was still in bed beside her. He was lying on his back, his eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling. And then, in a voice that was not his, a voice that was low, guttural, and unnervingly familiar, Jake spoke. "Emily, why won't you let me in?" The words sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't breathe. It was the entity. It had found a way to speak through him, to wear him like a mask. She pressed herself against the wall, wishing she could disappear, wishing she could erase the last few weeks. The house, the whispers, the entity. It was all consuming. And now, Jake was no longer Jake. He was something else. Emily realized she might have already lost him. The storm came in the dead of night, howling winds rattling the windows as sheets of rain beat against the house. Emily lay in bed, staring into the darkness. The storm was the least of her worries. The oppressive silence in the house had returned, thicker than ever, as if something were waiting. The air was heavy, filled with a sense of dread that twisted around her like a physical presence. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was the night everything would change. Jake was lying beside her, still and silent, but she couldn't bear to look at him. She could feel his cold presence, the weight of his vacant stare, even with his eyes shut. But worse than that, there was nothing of him left in his movements, in his words, in the way he breathed. He was merely an empty shell, a vessel for something that was not him. The entity had claimed him, and it was taking him further away from her with every passing moment. Emily knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act, had to escape before it was too late. But where could she go? The house was theirs. They'd made it their home. The town was miles away. The whole world felt suffocatingly close, like she was trapped in a web of her own making. Suddenly she heard it, a faint creak, like something heavy shifting in the attic. She froze, heart pounding, every hair on her body standing on end. The scratching had returned, but it was more deliberate now, more methodical. It wasn't just the sounds of an animal. It was something far worse, something intentional. Without thinking, Emily got up. Her feet moved on their own accord, as if drawn by some invisible force. She reached for the flashlight by the bed, but her hand trembled so much that it took her 2 tries to grip it. She couldn't let herself hesitate. The stairs creaked as she ascended, the sound magnified by the silence of the house. Her every step felt as though it were echoing through the walls, alerting whoever, or whatever, was watching. When she reached the top of the staircase, she paused, standing at the threshold of the attic door. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust, and something rotting, something decayed. The attic door was slightly ajar. Emily's stomach lurched as the familiar feeling of dread clawed at her chest. She hadn't touched it. She hadn't gone near it. Yet there it was, wide open, as if the house were inviting her inside. She reached out, her hand trembling as she pushed the door further open. The stairs to the attic seemed endless in the dim light, and each step felt heavier than the last. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, the chill crawling deep into her bones. She hesitated for just a moment, but then a sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the attic. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to look behind her, but the darkness of the hallway was empty. Jake's figure wasn't in sight. He hadn't followed her. But the footsteps in the attic didn't stop. Something, or someone, was up there. She grabbed the flashlight, holding it out in front of her like a weapon, and took a shaky step forward. Each movement felt as though it were taking her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The sounds grew louder, the creaking of the floorboards, the heavy breathing, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving closer to her, descending the ladder. It was coming down. Emily's heart raced as her legs nearly gave out beneath her. But she refused to look away, refused to let her fear take control. She couldn't turn back now. She had to know. She had to face it. Then, through the dim beam of the flashlight, she saw it. A figure at the top of the attic stairs, tall, slender, and unnatural. The shape was almost human, but the proportions were wrong. The figure leaned over the railing, its head tilted at an angle too sharp, too inhuman. Its eyes, dark, empty, soulless, were fixed on her. Emily gasped and stumbled backward, the beam of light flickering erratically as her hands trembled. She couldn't look away. She couldn't scream. It wasn't just a shadow. It was real. It was alive. Then, a voice so low, so twisted, it made the air vibrate. "Emily." The name was whispered, but it didn't come from the figure. It came from inside her own head. It was familiar, yet not. It was Jake's voice, but wrong, layered with something ancient, something dark. "You shouldn't have come up here." The words made her stomach churn. She backed away again, her feet slipping on the wooden floor. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. And then she saw it, a flash of movement in the mirror hanging on the wall beside her. She whirled around, the beam of the flashlight illuminating her face in a desperate rush. And for a split second, she thought she saw Jake. But it wasn't him. In the reflection, standing behind her, was a figure that looked like Jake, but his eyes weren't his. They were black, empty pits, like two endless voids that swallowed all light. He smiled, a wide, twisted grin, and Emily felt a chill so cold it numbed her entire body. Number it wasn't Jake. Whatever it was wearing his face. And now it was standing right behind her. The world around Emily felt as if it were suffocating her. The walls, the attic, the house itself. All seemed to pulse with a dark energy that crushed the air from her lungs. The figure in the reflection wasn't just standing behind her. It was invading her thoughts, sinking into her very mind like a parasite. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned slowly. But there was no one there. Just the cold, empty hallway. She spun back toward the attic door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the flashlight's beam shaking uncontrollably. The figure wasn't in the attic anymore, but the absence of it felt worse. Emily stumbled toward the stairs, her legs trembling beneath her. She needed to get out, get away. Her only thought was to run, to escape the suffocating grip of this house. She reached for the banister, but the moment her hand touched it, the house groaned, as if it were waking up, aware of her attempt to leave. The walls seemed to close in on her, whispering, groaning, as if the house was alive. She didn't look back. With frantic steps, Emily rushed down the stairs, the flashlight swinging wildly in her grip. The floorboards creaked beneath her, echoing through the house, and she could hear it, the footsteps, slow and deliberate. It was coming after her. A scream rose in her throat, but before she could release it, the door slammed shut. The entire house seemed to tremble with a sound that was part growl, part laugh, deep and guttural, reverberating through the walls and filling her mind with dread. She tried the door handle, but it was stuck, as if the house itself had decided she wasn't allowed to leave. She turned, panic welling inside her, as she faced the darkened hallway behind her. Jake. Jake was right there, standing in the doorway, his face still, so still, but his eyes were black as pitch, and the twisted grin stretched across his face like a macabre mask. "Where are you going, Emily?" he whispered, his voice layered with something otherworldly, something that wasn't his own. The sound was a cacophony of voices, Jake's, but distorted, mixed with something alien, something ancient. The voice was everywhere, echoing inside her skull. "You let me in, Emily. You let me in." The words hit her like a blow, their meaning crashing over her. It was him. It was Jake. But it wasn't. The entity had taken him, possessed him completely. Emily's mind raced, trying to reconcile the man she had once known with the terrifying thing before her. The entity had worn him down, stripped away his soul, until only this husk remained. "Please, Emily, don't run. It's too late." Jake's smile widened, showing teeth far too sharp, and his eyes, those deep, bottomless voids, seemed to swallow the light around him. The door was locked. She couldn't escape. The house had her trapped, and so did he. Or rather the thing wearing his face. It was all a lie. It had always been a lie. Jake was gone, and in his place was something that was not human, something that had been waiting for her. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to get out. She had to leave. She couldn't let the entity take her, too. But before she could take another step, the figure lunged at her. In the blink of an eye, it was across the room, towering over her. She gasped, stumbling backward, but it was too fast. It grabbed her arm, its grip like iron, its fingers cold and unnatural. Its face, Jake's face, was inches from hers, that smile still twisted, still wrong. "I never left, Emily. I was always here." The house seemed to respond to the entity's words. The walls quivered, the floor creaked beneath their feet, and the attic door swung wide open, as if calling them back. Emily could see shadows shifting within, crawling along the edges of the room, just out of view, as though they were waiting for the right moment to strike. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She struggled in its grasp, but the thing holding her was too strong, too powerful. Then in a sudden burst of clarity, Emily remembered the cameras, the footage, the figure creeping down the attic ladder night after night. It hadn't been after Jake. It had been after her. The entity had been watching her. It knew her fears, her secrets. And now, it was wearing Jake's body, speaking through his voice, trying to break her down piece by piece. She had to break free. With all the strength she could muster, she twisted out of its grip, pushing back with her elbow. She backed toward the door, breathing hard, her mind racing for an escape, but the house seemed to pulse in time with her heart, pulling her in. It was too late. But then, as if responding to her desperation, the front door burst open. A rush of cold air swept through the house, and Emily looked toward it, her eyes widening. There, standing on the threshold, was an older man, tall and shadowed, his presence a dark silhouette against the stormy night. His face was obscured, but there was something familiar about him, a trace of recognition she couldn't quite place. The thing wearing Jake's face let out a low growl, its eyes flashing. It snapped its head toward the door, the grin fading into something much darker. "No one escapes, Emily." The voice, Jake's voice, was now guttural, distorted beyond recognition. The man at the door took a step forward, and for a split second, Emily felt a surge of hope. The man reached out, and the house seemed to tremble. The shadows, the whispers, they stilled for a moment. But then as the man's hand reached for her, the world tilted, and the house collapsed in on itself. The walls, the floor, the door, everything blurred into a swirl of darkness and shadows. The last thing Emily saw before the world went black was Jake's smiling face, eyes burning with an unnatural fire. "You let me in." Cut to black.